on the environment map tool in Rhino for rendering. Those are two things that we never really talked about. And the Boolean split was actually part of the matrix for the grading. So everybody kind of got a free 15 points or so because I never talked about it. But I want to briefly talk about it tonight so that you guys know how to do it. And basically, it's if you have two objects, coming together, and instead of joining them, you can basically split the one object so that they meet flushly. I don't know. I'm about to do one of these, right? And then it trims off this section, and then you're just left with what's underneath, and it's aligned properly to that plane. That makes sense? I'm sure it does. Just being really dumb about explaining it. So I'm going to open up Rhino and just kind of briefly walk through that for a second, and then also show how to create an environment map, because what an environment map basically does is it throws that 3D sky in the background, and when you render, the reflectivity of your materials actually pick up that sky in the detail. And so it just adds a little more realistic making up words tonight, to the render itself. So with that, let's just reopen this project. So I'm just going to go ahead and shift these off to the side for now. So if we look at our right image here, and you'll see that this cylinder protrudes up into the seat here. We can see that that's a clear kind of projection, and we don't necessarily want to connect those two pieces together, but we want to trim the cylinder and cut it off at the seat so that we can delete this part of it. We can utilize under the solid tool the Boolean split tool. And so we talked about the union and difference, but this is the Boolean split. And so basically it asks select the surface or poly surface to split, which is going to be the cylinder, and then it says to press enter, and then it asks to select the cutting surface, and that would be the seat itself, and enter. And the line work disappears, but if you look at, it's obviously still there, right? But this piece of the cylinder is now separate from this piece, and so we can delete that, and it now just has a cleaner edge to it. So if we turned off the seat and we're looking at this, you can see there's that little line right there that this now drops back at a slight diagonal. And so we could have done that to kind of all of these shapes. So for instance, this shape is protruding into these shapes. We could cut that out more or less so that it's not there, and then join all those objects together so it's all one object with the join tool, obviously. So that was one thing that I just didn't think to mention prior. But in the future, going forward, you may want to do that with anything you model in the software. So, I don't want to turn the line work on. I want to turn the seat back on. So, now I'm trying to remember what the heck's going on here. So in order to apply an environment map to the background, right now it's just grayscale, right? And I have, for some reason, gray and shadow checked in my properties here. If we go to our render settings, which is in the document properties, we have here what's called an environment. So we could choose, we could click on ambient light and change kind of the color of ambient light too, but the it could be a solid color versus kind of a gradient between two colors, or it could actually be a material. And so it has no environment right now, and if we were to edit this environment, I just right clicked it actually and clicked edit. We can change the name of it, and then the background color is color here, but we could apply an image to that. And so right now it's empty, and it it took me directly to where I didn't want to go. But if we were to go back to, it should have opened up your render content, and there's environments, and so there's a few that come standard with the software, but they're not super great. And so what you can do though is navigate to somewhere else and pick an image. So I had downloaded one of those 360 skies, and we can go ahead and put that in as our environment. And what happens is, if you look at this circle, is it starts to show the reflectivity of the sky on the material itself. And so it's a pretty cool feature. And it's not showing up in here at the moment. Let me double check that. I feel like this came up last time as well. And it's because it didn't save. Okay. So that's one from Rhino itself. I just kind of trying to fool it so I can get my own image in here a little bit. So going back to my F drive here to 243. I think it's in a, I don't remember what assignment it's in. Didn't change. I'm starting to go cross-eyed staring at this computer screen all day. Why aren't you changing today? There we go. So this opens up the similar kind of characteristic of what we see as like the material and the manipulation of it. That this little guy right here, these four little dots took me directly to where I could input an image into there. And that should I'm getting yelled at by my computer today. Well, this is new.
Could you possibly go back to the settings real quick?
Yeah. So I created a new one, and I ended up grabbing one of these environments that it that it has as a default, and I opened that up, and then I directly went and said, okay, I'm going to change it, and it says all supported formats here, and so I mean, an image is a supported format, and so and I opened it, it works. Click OK, and you can rename it. Click OK, and of course it's the same image. And it looks kind of funny because there's no ground plane here. So if we were to go to our ground plane and turn that on, you start to have a horizon line. And when we render that out, when you apply materials to this stuff, because I don't have materials applied to this project, but let's just do that for a second here and put on a metal silver material. You can see that in the rendered form that the sky starts to get reflected on that surface. So that's really what the goal of what I was trying to show you. So you could also, get more elaborate and put grass down, or add in a floor so it's not floating, and render it out, and I already did that. So in Photoshop, what I got else going on here? Close that. We can go File, Open, and go to wherever you saved those images. Hopefully everybody has downloaded those by now. And let's open up this new chair. Click Open. Because before I go too far into this, let's just quickly talk about a new document. So when you click File, New, it gives you an array of options. I have some presets already defined, and typically like US paper size 8.5 by 11, legal or tabloid, and you can change how you want to size this thing, either by inches or pixels, or any other unit that you want to utilize. And then this is where you can also set the resolution of the image based upon inches or centimeters. And then this is where you can define whether you're working with RGB color or CMYK, so red, green, and blue, versus cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. I haven't had too much of a reason to get into the CMYK. I've always kind of just used the RGB, but either one, CMYK I guess gives you, they all give you the similar colors. They're all color. And then the bit size. As you increase the bits, the file large instantaneously grows. And so 8-bit is fine. And then the background content, you can define that to be transparent white or pick a background color. And so once you start to define these through custom here, you can do a save preset. And so that's what I've done for some different paper sizes that I use. But to be honest, I haven't had a need to use these paper sizes very much, because typically when I'm jumping into Photoshop, I already have an image that I've rendered that I want to do some post-processing on. And so typically you end up starting with a base image. And whenever you open up, like download an image from the internet and open it up, sometimes it doesn't have, it's not a layer, it's actually a background image and it's locked. And so we'll talk about that in just a second, but we can make it a layer from a locked layer typically. And so just to go through some of the tabs fairly quickly, because I wasted too much time in the beginning of class. Your edit command line, your command bar is up here. The edit command bar you can utilize to fill a layer or transform a layer. A lot of these you're really not going to mess with. I don't ever use the file bar much unless I'm going into my image and adjusting the image itself. And so the difference between image and layer is image, you're adjusting the entire image. So if we wanted to change the size of this image, right now, if you don't have rulers on, you can go down to View and click Rulers. It's also Control R. But you can see that this image is fairly small. It's 6.5 inches by like 3.5 inches. But if I click on my image size, it actually is 300 dpi. And so there's two ways to change the size of this. One is to literally reduce our resolution, like to 150, which is 150 pixels per inch, and the image gets larger. Or we could make it really small. Or you can resample the image size, and the resolution doesn't actually get more resolution, but it allows you to grow the image larger and keep it basically the same resolution more or less that you had. Some people will argue with me and say that it really doesn't, but I've never had much of a problem doing this. I think when you get down to something really small and you try to blow it up and then bring it back down, you will see a lot of pixelation. But generally, if your image is large enough and you just need it a bit larger, you can do this. And so basically, I'm going to take my 300 pixels and increase them to 1200 pixels. And that takes each pixel and divides it up into more pixels. I'm glad I'm getting the head nod there. And so what happens is it looks like it gets bigger. Control L or Control minus zooms out, and Control plus zooms in. It's actually still the same size image. It's a 6.5 inch image by a 3.5 inch image. I can go back to my image size and uncheck resampling the image. And just like before when I took my 300 pixels and dropped it to 150, my image doubled in size. If I drop this back to 300, my image now becomes 25 inches by 14 inches. It's revolutionary. So other things in here, canvas size. So if you want to increase the actual canvas size but keep your layers the same size, this is where you would do it. And you would basically define an anchor point. Does this canvas grow this way and this way, or does it grow in all four directions? But the layer itself that's on that canvas stays the same size. We don't really want to do that. But if you wanted to put like a nice white border around this, you know, that's an inch bigger than the image, you could do that. So I'm going to cancel that. Image rotation rotates the entire image. All the layers that accumulate rotate, pretty sure. And then this is where you'll find your modes, like where we were defining what we wanted, whether CMYK or RGB or grayscale. So this changes the entire image. And you could increase the bits as well. And the adjustments are adjustments to the image itself, and so it happens to all of the layers, but we can talk about how to just make it happen to one particular layer. But if you notice, kind of all of these, vibrance, hue, saturation, color balance, black and white, photo filter, channel mixer, exposure, brightness, contrast, those are here in your adjustments. And if you don't have this up under Windows, you can have a quick access toolbar here. If you click on adjustments, that should be there. And so brightness, contrast, level adjustments, curve adjustments, exposure adjustments, vibrance, hue, saturation. So those are all located here, and they're also located here under adjustments. The one that I like to use most often before I start manipulating and adding more layers is HDR toning. It allows you to adjust, and it says, are you sure you want to do this? Because you'll flatten all your layers into one background image. But what it allows you to do is start to bump certain things. So I particularly like to bump my details up a bit, and the vibrance and the saturation down a little bit. You really kind of have to play with these settings a bit to get the image to start to look correct. But the exposure doesn't really do a whole lot. I wouldn't mess with that much. Shadows, if you start to notice, as I bump it up, it starts to like put this white stream around my shadows. I don't really like that, so I tend to kind of leave that similar. The highlights, I don't know, this image is kind of terrible. It made it, the HDR toning didn't do much for it. But you could start to play with the curve of your levels here. Oh, that was terrible. I also try to stay away from these curves as well. But it's a useful tool, and if you start to kind of understand it and how it works, it's a pretty powerful tool to utilize. Also, if you find that if you've done a bunch of renders from one model, right, and they're all fairly similar as far as the lighting and the content that's in them, you can go ahead and once you get one render looking really good and you're like, wow, those blacks really pop, and it just adds more definition with detail. At least I find when I bump the detail, the blacks of things start to pop out and adds a little more definition to the image. You can always save that custom as a preset, and then you can go ahead and continue using those level adjustments that you've kind of toned your eye into. So it takes a while to kind of figure that out, but once you do, you can save that preset and use it in other images that have the similar lighting qualities as what you started with your previous image. If I sat here for like 10 or 15 minutes, I could probably get this thing to look pretty good, but I don't really want to do that. I just want to show you the tool and that it's useful. There's other kind of settings here that don't really work very well, but like Surrealist. Ooh, that's a little scary. And of course, if you don't have your preview check button, you're not going to see any change happen. I'm going to go ahead and just cancel that. And you'll notice that it locked my background image. It made it a background versus a layer, and so you can't really change anything. If I double click it, I can create a layer out of it again. I think also shift and double click does the same thing. Okay, so layers, creating new layers here, but you also have a little tab right here under the layers toolbar here that you can create new layers as well. So a lot of the settings that are in here you'll find kind of in these two windows, except for filters. Filters are certainly unique. They can be applied to the whole image, or you could actually never have tried applying them to just one particular layer. Have you ever utilized filters for that particular layer? Yeah.
Yeah, they're just for they're layer by layer basis.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
But for instance, there's nothing on that layer. Sketching, bas relief, and yikes. Yeah, they're effects, and so you can manipulate it to kind of start to take on. If I use my zoom out, control minus, you can see that it takes on kind of sort of what it describes, but often you'll find that it looks very, I don't know what, machine-like it's, oh, all the lines are going in this one direction. It's like, I don't know about that. So be careful about using them, but they can create some cool effects.
they're good for texturing.
Yeah,
materials.
yeah, they're good for texturing. But I don't use them much. I like to use textures and overlays and blending modes. I think work just as well too. So, which is something I kind of want to get into tonight a little bit. We're not going to utilize that, but yeah. So, kind of going right into blending modes and adjustment layers. like for instance, brightness and contrast, it creates a layer that then gives you or allows you to change the brightness and the contrast of the layers below it. You can also right click it and create a clipping mask, which just affects the layer right below it. And so you have all these different effects that you can create utilizing those. But as you move this bar, you can see like the darker colors start to fade out to white, and the lighter colors start to get darker. And so that's kind of the concept behind blending modes, which are another part of the layer itself. So if I have a layer, I think it's easiest to see this with actually opening up another. Yeah, let's grab this one, the broken glass 0037. Open that up. And I'm just going to literally drag him in. And I'm going to press Control T, and that's the same as going up to edit transform, right? It's the quit key for it. And I'm just going to scale this thing up a bit and hit enter to finish the command. It's a really dark layer with some light areas. Up here, these are called blending modes. And so if I click on darken, it basically makes the white, or the whatever's white, transparent, right? And if I click lighten, it actually takes whatever's dark and makes it transparent, and so it starts to blend with the image, the layer behind it. And so with clipping masks on and things like that, you can start to, say you have a particular wall that you want to add a little bit more texture to, you can utilize a separate texture like this and add more detail to it. This is just kind of getting the understanding of what it is. This isn't a great example, but you can start adding that texture to other surfaces, and so you can make that surface have a different texture through the use of these overlays. So the other kind of cool thing about them is that we can start to add ambient shadow to elements as well. And so if I use my multiplier for a layer, basically I've just created a blank layer, it's a transparent layer, and I go down to my paint tool here. I have some options as well with the paint tool to apply a different type of blending mode to it, and I'm just going to stick with multiplier for now, and we can change our brush size here, but what I really want to do is kind of instead of increasing the hardness of my brush, which would get me like a solid shape, I really want that hardness to be pretty like 0 so that it just kind of fades away. And the size of this doesn't really matter at this point, the brush, because the bracket keys increase and decrease the size of the brush. So we can change that on the fly. And we can also change the opacity of the brush. to something fairly low, and we can start to add in some light ambient shadows, in areas where we think that they will appear. And it starts to just add a little more depth to the image. And we could make it smaller, right? And maybe increase our opacity size. If you have one of those drawing pads for Photoshop, it makes this really cool and a lot easier to use than your mouse. And I believe that our computer studio just got some of these pads, and they should be available. I don't know, Michael was playing with it like 2 weeks ago and was super geeked about it, and I couldn't tell if he had gotten them for all the computers or just one. It was just one workstation. Yeah, so you might have to fight for it, but they're really cool. Like, it's basically a pen and a touch screen, and you're just like drawing over whatever you've got. It's a lot easier than manipulating your mouse. So we could also create another layer and do this kind of not for ambient shadow, but maybe for some vignetting to soften the edges of the image itself. And so I can increase the brush size pretty large. And this technique, Dan Temple was like the king of this technique. I'm not that great at it. I don't typically like to use it. But if you ever looked at like old photographs or we can start to drop this back behind that and maybe reduce its opacity a little bit. I don't know, you can start to do some kind of cool effects here. And the other one that I just kind of got introduced to is the posterize adjustment, which is kind of cool in the fact that it starts to smooth out some of that vignetting that you do a little bit and create some cooler effects. So I would encourage you to play around with these levels. We'll talk more about them next class period. But there's so many of them and they're so vast that you can't cover them all. So it's really up to you guys to kind of play with them and see what you can do with them. But this is kind of like a basic concept of what you can do with them. Some other kind of cool things is we can apply layer masks to like a particular layer. And so maybe, and that's this button right here. And so with layer masks, you can basically take away part of the image. And so it's black is basically transparent and then white puts it back on. So if I were to start doing the opposite of the vignetting, this is pretty strong. I'm going to Control Z that, and Control Alt Z allows me to continue to undo. I'm going to reduce this opacity a little bit and maybe make my brush just a little bit smaller. But you can start to fade images off too into white space. And so if we added a layer here and put it underneath our object layer and Shift F5, come on little buddy, brings up my fill. So that's the same as going to edit fill, Shift F5. And I can drop in a color and choose whatever color I want. I'm going to choose white and click OK. You can kind of see, whoops, what that effect starts to do. It starts to fade that image away. And so you kind of have to do it. If you want the corners to completely disappear, you bump your opacity up to 100, right? And just start to get the corners itself to disappear. And so when you drop this image on your board, let's say, you know, that you start to fade out the edges of those images. Sometimes that's a nice effect, sometimes it's not. You have to be careful. It's all about kind of your eye and looking at your boards and going, does that work? I don't know, maybe let's go back into Photoshop and take that layer off, put it back on your board, see if that works out better for you. So as I kind of turn this stuff back on, you can see kind of the weird effects that start to occur here, and maybe that posterize doesn't work out so well, so I'll smooth it out a little bit more. It blends that black and white together a little bit. So just talking about some of these other tools that are accessible, the marquee tool is here. It has 3 different functions. I'm going to just go ahead and turn off some of these layers because I want to and I can right click on that layer mask and I can disable the layer mask so that I'm just working with, I'm back to the regular image if I turn off all those layers and disable that mask, but I didn't delete it, it's still there. And so you can right click it and enable it again. But I'm going to disable it for a moment. And so the marquee tool allows you to select certain parts of the whatever layer you're on, and you could maybe Control C, Control V, and it would copy whatever inside there and paste it to a new layer. But you can also utilize that to do a clipping mask as well, which is this clipping mask tool, right? And it will then utilize, you know, it's just clipping that particular part of the image out. Oops, I drew right on the image. That was bad. Click on the clipping mask. I'm still drawing right on the image. There we go. So basically, if I disable that clipping mask, the image is still there in the background, right? So if you have something that you only want a piece of, but you don't really want to erase the entire image, you can marquee out what you want to keep or what you want to delete and utilize a clipping mask to hide whatever you want to keep or whatever you don't want to keep. That makes some sense. Hope it does. But this isn't the only function of the clipping mask, or there's other ways to draw clipping masks. So, or I'm sorry, the marquee tool. This is one way, and if I hold this button down, I have an option to create a circular marquee tool or just a single row marquee tool, which I've never really used. But the button below it is, there's 3 functions in there. There's the lasso tool, which is like drawing freehand the marquee. The lasso, the polygon lasso tool allows you to draw straight lines, but it also at different angles. And then the magic wand, or the magic lasso tool, let's just kind of look at the 3 different ones here. Also when you select on your marquee tool, there's an option to sketch basically a new selection, or add to your original selection, or subtract from your original selection up here. So be aware of which setting you're on, because if you want to add it to this, right, and I start to draw here, that goes away, right? So what I really want to do is maybe add to it, and that allows me to draw freehand. And I have to you always have to end up at the same place that you started to finish it. Sometimes that's tough to grab with the freehand, but if you use the polygon lasso, you can kind of start to get in and define, exactly where you want this thing to go, right? But we could take this one step further. This is a little tedious, hit the control minus. And so that added in that little section, right? If the magic wand, not the magic wand, the magnetic lasso, I want to also add to this. If I select here, it's going to start to trace whatever kind of line work that you've got going, and sometimes it doesn't pick exactly what you want. So I'm going to hit escape, and you can change the frequency and the width of it, and so you can fine tune that, but it doesn't necessarily work as well as you might want it to. And so what they have right below it is what's called the magic wand tool, or the quick select tool. The quick select tool, you can change the size of the selection agent. It's kind of like a brush size, right? Where you're increasing, you can increase the size of the brush itself, and the hardness of it, and the spacing. But basically it starts to quickly select stuff, and it kind of makes some assumptions and does it similar to the magic wand, or the magnetic, but it just does it a little faster. And then the other one, the magic wand tool, you can set your tolerance of that. 30 is kind of pretty good, but it'll start to select a particular color, and so it's really kind of one of the better ones, I think, and we can decrease the tolerance maybe halfway to start to only look at what's inside here. And of course it picked up a little bit here, and so what we can actually do is utilize our lasso tool to subtract that bit that it picked up. And so we go in here and subtract that out of our selection, right? Then now we're just getting the entire background. And so I could choose to utilize my paint bucket here and start to hide that entire selection. So I'm not deleting the image, but if I wanted to delete it, I could just press delete and it would delete what I had selected. So depending on if you want to keep the image intact or not, you can make that selection your choice. You can also duplicate a material or a layer before you start manipulating it, so that if you do screw up on it and delete it when you didn't really want to, you always have a backup layer of whatever you're working with. and that's right clicking and duplicate layer. So yeah, so at any rate, what I want to get to is let's drop that sky that we put in our environment map into the Photoshop file, so that the reflectance here, you know, it starts to look a little more realistic, more or less. So I'm going to Control D deselects whatever you have selected by the marquee tool. And I think I'm going to put I'm going to toggle to my white, which is, you can also utilize the X, the letter X, to toggle between those two. And I think I'm going to put back in to change my brushes to normal. I'm going to put back in the foreground here, at least most of it, just so when we drop our background image in, and maybe we'll change our brush to a hard brush so we can just get that line. I'm going to hold shift down too, and that kind of locks it orthographically in one direction depending on which way you start to go. Typically I just delete my background if I don't already have a transparent background, or when I render it as a PNG so that when it brings it into Photoshop the background drops out, but this PNG didn't do that. So we can go to File, Open, and open up our sky thumbnail large that we downloaded, and that was a little big. So if we go back to our image and look at the size of it, it's only 72 pixels per inch, and it's 16 inches by 4 inches. That's a little small, because if we wanted to increase that, right, to 300, it would be 4 inches by 1 inch. So I'm going to resample the size of it, and I'm going to put in, what was the last time I did 1200, and that like took an astronomical long time, so I'm just going to go with 300 and click OK. And what that should allow me is, now that both the resolutions of this and this image are 300, this should stay 17 inches long. I can literally drag it and not do that. So if you have a clipping mask on, which is what this is doing, it's clipped and only looking at this image, and you have this layer selected, it pops it in right above it, and then it becomes a clipping mask on it just gets funky. So I just changed my layer to being something else, and hopefully that won't happen, and it doesn't. But we want to move this down below, right? And it's a little small, but we can always utilize Control T and bump it up a little bit here. And maybe we want this to kind of follow the focal point of the image a little bit. So that kind of being your eye drops back to that as the focal point there. But we still have kind of this extra layer. We can always right click this and duplicate the layer and start to blend these two layers together utilizing a clipping mask. So I'm going to put a clipping mask on the layer that's above this lower layer, and utilize my brush tool and hit X to flip it back to black, because that makes the image transparent. And I want to take my brush size and reduce the hardness of it, and the opacity. I want to reduce the opacity of it a bit too. And as I do that, I'm painting or blending these two layers together. I'm going to increase my brush size just a little bit so that it goes a little bit faster, but it's kind of just eliminating that line, so but it's, you know, extending the image. And so you kind of, it just blends those two background images together so that you can extend the image. And now that I've done that, I can select both of them by holding the Shift key and selecting them individually, and we can merge those layers together so that they become one layer. And it may not have been the right location to do that, because now that I look at this a little closer, this pattern's starting to repeat a little bit. But at any rate, you get the idea of the concept behind it, and so you can start to utilize background images to make stuff stand out. And then we can put all of our layers back on here. So what we didn't get to today was doing custom textures, but we will get to that first thing on Tuesday. Assignment 2 is up. It's due next Thursday evening, and all the images that you need are going to be on the S drive. I didn't want to upload like a bunch of entourage and images, but it's the same concept, and we'll work on it on Tuesday. I'll start out, but if you want to play around with it and see if you can manipulate, it's basically there's a before image and an after image, and what you want to do is take the before image and try to make it look like the after image. And there's some extra entourage and some people that you'll drag in to put in the image. And so it's basically doing the similar techniques that we've talked about, just kind of applying them to a real world render scenario where there's a building, and you want to put a couple people in, some trees in the background, and kind of blend everything together to make it look nice. And I think the image is kind of dark, and so you have to play with the levels, you know, the adjustments to get the image to look right. And so it's really not more complicated than that. It just takes some kind of time and effort to play around with it. Over the weekend, I plan on playing around with it, and then on Tuesday, we'll talk about kind of walking through some of the concepts that I use to get the image to look right. But I would encourage you to play with it this weekend for an hour and see what you can do, and then maybe come back at it Tuesday night or Wednesday, you know, to redo it and for the submittal. And so you'll submit the after image that you create, and then basically a print screen of the layers that you've created. The file itself is too large to upload. So we just kind of want two images, one being the after image that you create, not the after image that I've given you, which I will be able to tell because there's a watermark on both of them, and the watermark's in different places, and it's going to be a hell of a time to get that to move. So that's one thing that won't look the same. But at any rate, I encourage you to look at it over the weekend. If you don't want to put it off till I kind of show you some of the layers on Tuesday, that's fine too. But it's there. And so if anybody isn't on the S drive, you need to get on the S drive to get those images. And so I need people that haven't been on the S drive yet at all need to give me your email address on the sign-in sheet so that I can send that to Michael. And in the process, it gives you access to the files. You can still get on the S drive, but you can't actually get back into the files. So it's kind of a two-step process there. So you need to download the Quick Connect tool, which the link is on BB Learn. So there's a link for Mac and a link for Windows. So yeah, that's all I got for you tonight. See you guys next week.
So just for right now, you want me to write my